Hello, everyone. How are you doing? Oh, okay. I see I'm going to have to start over. How's everyone doing tonight? Oh, that's better. Thank you for coming out. This is so exciting. We're here at the historic Strand Books, and great panel for you. And you know what, 4 years, my sort of start with 33 and the Third, 4 years ago, I started the podcast. And for iTunes, you have to have 3 shows in the can before you submit to them. And one of the first shows I did was with Susan Fast, which is book 100 in the series, which she did on Michael Jackson's Dangerous. And I was so nervous, like even asking her. I emailed her because she's in Canada, and she was coming in town for the book signing. I said, okay, well, I'll be at the book signing. I can meet you afterwards. I go to there, and like I have no track record whatsoever, and I'm like, okay, why would she do my podcast? She doesn't know who the hell I am. Afterwards, I'm so nervous. I'm like, Miss Fass, I was wondering, if you could, do my podcast, and she was like, sure, I'll do it. And that was one of the first 3 episodes. And since then, I've interviewed 2 of the gentlemen here. I've interviewed George and Ryan for their books, and also Jen Pelly, who did a book on The Raincoats, a great book, all great books. And what I love about the 33 and the Third books is how you have passionate music lovers writing about their passions. And 33 and the Third have done this over and over for the past 10 years because it is their 10-year anniversary. And I just think it's wonderful that you have a press that's doing this. So kudos not only to the writers, but to 33 and the Third series for 10 years of great books. So my first question is, when did you first hear the album that you wrote about? So we got, George, you did it on Miles Davis, Bitches Brew. Let's start with you.
Let me see. I think it was, when was I born? It was 1979 or 1980. I had a good friend in high school, and we would walk home from school and go to his house and go in the basement, and his parents had a really interesting and eclectic jazz collection, and we just started listening through them. And, we put that one on at some point, and that was it.
Okay. Was it an immediate sensation for you? Or because I found it like a kind of a difficult album.
Yeah, we were listening to, Charlie Parker. I was listening to a lot of Dexter Gordon. Mm-hmm. And we were playing, he played trumpet and I played saxophone. And we were playing, we were trying to learn how to play jazz. And we were listening to, we knew the classic first quintet with Coltrane and Red Garland, etc. We knew those Prestige records, and it was just like, Miles Davis. It's Miles Davis. So you listen to everything Miles Davis did, and the album cover itself too was a little bit. It's unusual. So we put it on, and it was totally different than anything else, of course, that we had heard at the time. And that includes, we were listening to Stanley Clarke and Return to Forever, the whole spectrum of things. And it's, it was important to me, and Miles Davis is important to me, and it just, that kind of thing sticks with you.
Yeah. And for you, Christopher, you did Public Enemy's Takes a Nation of Millions, which is the 30th anniversary this year, right? Is it 30?
That's correct, yes. It's like I first started listening to pretty much any rap music that existed when I was like 8 years old, and was just completely devouring it, and like had teachers telling me to stop turning in assignments that are about rap music. And as an 8, 9, 10-year-old, I don't know if I really fully internalized what Public Enemy was.
I'm shocked.
But like I knew it was good and I liked it, and I didn't hear the entire record until going back, after, having my suburban white boy identity crisis, growing my hair long, listening to Nine Inch Nails, and then going back to this stuff I liked when I was, much younger, and this was during high school, and and it's like I started to understand like what made Run DMC powerful, what made Public Enemy powerful, and absorbing a lot of music writing during that time as well. So it definitely was like the seeds were planted very young, and then it it grew once I got a little older.
Okay. Were there dreams of you being an MC at 8?
Yes, there was. My MC name was Fresh C. I was a very large child, so I definitely. It hit me really hard when Heavy D died because he like made it okay for like heavy people. Mm-hmm. When I was like 10 years old, I'd be like, "That's what a role model looks like to me." Yeah. And, so like I was bummed, but yes, I definitely had dreams of rocking the mic.
Thank you. And Amanda, you did Nick Drake's Pink Moon.
Yeah, it's kind of a funny story for me because I'm such a sort of resolutely analog girl. So my kind of introductory story to Nick Drake is weird in that I was in college in the late 90s, and it was my first exposure to a high-speed internet connection. And this was sort of the Wild West days of the internet and of Napster in particular. And someone who was living in my dorm was like, "Hey, check this out." And I just remember having, I think probably many people my age had I don't know, this kind of mix of panic and glee, the sort of supermarket sweep, like freak out of like, oh my God, it's, all the music in the world and it's on the internet and it's for free. And so I came to Nick Drake that way. It was just before the VW Cabriolet commercial that kind of, sort of led the renaissance of his music, the posthumous renaissance of his music. And I was trying to download something else. God knows what. I don't know what I was after in those days, probably like a Grateful Dead bootleg. But I opened an MP3 that was misfiled, which many of the things were on Napster in the late 90s. And it was Pink Moon. And it was one of those experiences, you have this sometimes, I think, when you meet someone and you sort of fall in love with them instantly, or you meet someone and you say like, all right, we're fast friends. And I remember listening to that song and thinking like, this is my favorite song. I thought that before it was even over. So it was just came quick for me.
Mm-hmm. Did you like music like that, like Spare and folk? Was that something you were listening to beforehand?
Yeah, absolutely. I was a big fan of that stuff. I'd been a fan of a lot of other kind of bands of the British folk revival. But Nick Drake in the late 90s, it's funny to think of it now when he's, fairly popular as far as these things go, as far as famous folk records go. But back then he was still extraordinarily obscure. So while I had listened to some of his contemporaries, I'd listened to other, bands and artists. Joe Boyd, for example, had produced some of the other things of the British folk revival. I had no idea. It was kind of squarely in my wheelhouse, but I had no idea it existed before that moment.
Okay, great. And for you, Ryan, LCD Soundsystem's Sound of Silver.
Yeah, I heard it in high school when the album was brand new. And I had an art teacher who was sort of my guide for a lot of, cooler new music. Things didn't really trickle into Pennsylvania as quickly, even though it was the blog era and all that kind of stuff.
Slow drip.
And he had this sound system in our art room that was kind of fittingly enough, given the nature of that album, built from all this sort of 70s junk that he'd found at various estate sales and things like that. But it was also a very good sound system, so it was this kind of old retro thing. And we just used to play that kind of after hours. And it was well timed because I was kind of planning to move to New York, and it's a deeply New York album, despite ending with a song about how New York sucks now.
Yeah.
So.
And for all of you, there's many albums. You love these albums. To write about them, what does it take to write about them? Like, why this particular album? Because I've seen the 33 1/3, the proposal, and it's not an easy road to do the proposal. So why do this album? Christopher?
Well, my original pitch was going to be on Company Flow's Fun Crusher Plus.
Okay.
Because, it was the era when, I saw like the indie rap dream as like the new punk rock. I saw it sort of, come up and explode and then fade away. Mm-hmm. And like that story was really fascinating to me. And I believe it was Michelangelo Matos who wrote the Prince 33 1/3, who basically was like, they're never going to pick that. Do not do that. Yeah. And
too obscure? Is it?
I mean, like, it might have been too obscure. It's like you want to have a record that's going to have a little bit of a wide reach. Mm-hmm. And I just I came up with a pitch for this record, which at the time was maybe my second favorite record,
Okay.
and now has maybe graduated to my favorite record. But I came up with the pitch in like a night, I think, and turned it in, and then here we are.
Yeah.
Now I'm in the rare book room.
I know, imagine that. George, what about you?
Well, for me, it was when there was an opportunity to write the proposal. There was a few other things that I was thinking of too, especially Kraftwerk's Computer World.
Okay.
But I mean, for 30 years, I've been walking around, no matter where I am, and Bitches Brew just pops into my consciousness, and there's things that I've been thinking about it for that long, and they've just been simmering there, and kind of building up that, that both need and desire to articulate, it was just this is the one that I have to do. I mean, just it's there for a reason in my head all the time, and because I'd been thinking about it for so long, I had the idea very clearly from the very beginning.
Okay. And what did you think you would have to say about this album? Maybe that hadn't been said before.
Well, part of it is that I have the advantage, which is that there's really, at the time I was doing the proposal, nothing specifically had been said about it other than record reviews and things like that. Except I will point out there's a very fine book in Italian, which is the English translation of the title is Bitches Brew, the Genesis of a Masterpiece. Okay. And it's great, and it's really dense and detailed. It's it's close to 400 pages long, so and beautifully illustrated. But it's it's in Italian, and I think also in Spanish now. But it's not available in America. And so this was and plus it's Miles Davis's Bitches Brew. It's Miles Davis, who is one of the handful of incredible artists in all fields in the 20th century. So it's you got to have something on.
Yeah, definitely. And Amanda, for you?
Yeah, Pink Moon was sort of a tricky book. I mean, many of the entries in the series, as you guys probably know, will sort of approach their subject maybe from a historical perspective or from a more repertorial perspective. And with Pink Moon, I mean, it's a 28-minute acoustic guitar record. There's one overdub. He recorded it over 2 nights with an engineer who is credited as a producer, but was largely really just an engineer. It was a record, Nick wrote on his own. He was dead 2 years after he made it. So, and it was largely ignored in his lifetime. There were a few little reviews. He'd given one interview. I mean, the thought of kind of trying to tell the story of how that record got made felt literally impossible. But there was this other thing that sort of happened, in the decades following his death, which was people found their way to it. I mean, much like the, kind of goofy story I just told, there are all these, everyone has a sort of Nick Drake story. And I was particularly interested in that Volkswagen commercial, which was a sort of watershed moment for advertising. It was a kind of watershed moment for the use of pop music in advertising. And I'd reached out to this guy named Shane Hutton, who was the copywriter for that commercial. He was just 24 years old when he wrote it and picked the song for it. And it sort of became a little bit of a story about, that experience for him, in which, for a brief period of time after that commercial first aired, he was just attacked, kind of from every direction by Nick Drake fans who felt he had sort of slaughtered this sacred cow. I mean, he was getting death threats. It was really wild. So I thought that was a kind of story that hadn't been told yet. I thought he was an interesting person. I thought that commercial is quite interesting to me as a sort of tiny little film, or as this sort of aspirational advertising that later became really ubiquitous, but at the time was kind of new. It was directed by Jonathan Dayton and Valerie Ferris, who later went on to direct Little Miss Sunshine and Ruby Sparks. It was shot by a guy named Lance Accord, who shot Lost in Translation. It was a really beautifully made commercial, but it was a commercial nonetheless. And I was sort of interested, having grown up as kind of a punk rock kid, who was, always calling sort of bullshit and sellout on everything. This idea of how do we sort of reconcile this thing? It's selling me a car, but it's really lovely. And it's also been a vehicle to sort of bring this music to so many people who wouldn't have heard it otherwise. Those were interesting tensions. And I think for me that became like, all right, well, I can write about that,
Okay. And what about you, Ryan?
Am I allowed to talk about how mine came about? You're an editor.
Yes.
Yeah, all right. Well, like a lot of other kind of young music writers, I'd kind of always had this ambition to write a 33 and a third, and probably would have pitched, or at least Sound of Silver would have been one of the ones I would have pitched. But mine didn't go through the normal route. it was because they had this reunion and it kind of had to be done sort of quickly.
Yeah.
So we didn't have access to the band or time to figure any of that out. And partially because it was an album that came out in the internet era, we sort of decided that maybe didn't matter. And if you wanted to know the story of how that album was made, you could find it. So there was originally a much bigger idea of like sort of tracing the history of the New York rock album through different kind of subcultures, which also wasn't really possible given the circumstances. So it just kind of turned into a sort of series of essays about, kind of approaching Sound of Silver from different angles. And it's sort of similar to the original pitch, but it didn't go through that sort of traditional 33 1/3 gestation.
Okay. Is that a challenge, not being able to have access to who the album is about?
It wasn't great, but I mean, like a lot of people do these and people who are long dead.
Yeah.
So I think it's just that when the option's there, people now expect you to do that, or at least kind of talk to some people who worked on the album. But that was also like, I don't know that what we would have done differently had I actually spent time with James, because like that wasn't the approach we wanted to follow anyway. I think it would have turned into like there being a chapter that was a profile of James, and then I would just still be kind of, riffing on whatever otherwise.
And how did you, speaking of approach, how did you decide on the approach for the book? Because some of the books people have done, novels, and it's more personal. Some it's just biographies of the artist. Like, how did you decide what direction you would go in writing the book? Whoever wants to take that.
Well, I can. That's actually the key to how I wrote it, which is that I mean, the main thing for me is that Bitches Brew it's right in that unusual spot that jazz has in America, which is it's a once popular music that became an art music, and still has it's not popular in the sense of popularity, but it's popular in the sense of style. And so you have this, and you have, the best-selling jazz artist of all time, a guy who was one of the few real superstars, cultural superstars in America, who was also a jazz musician. And he puts out this record, and of course he was going through changes, and that was his great quality. But this is an incredibly avant-garde record. I mean, this is avant-garde in the avant-garde, and it still is. It's it's not avant-garde jazz, it's not avant-garde rock. It's incredibly avant-garde music in the sense of contemporary modern experimental music, and it still sells 1 million copies, and it's out there, and it's part of the canon of this amazing artist. And so this was the point, and to make that point work for me, it was give the historical context. Where what was he doing? What was the work happening around him in jazz? What was his place in jazz, which was always very singular, and also just his quality as an artist, which is this, he never repeat himself. I did that once. Now I have to do something else. Why would you do something you've already done? Always changing, always changing.
Okay. What about you, Christopher?
I wish you would go full miles and just do the whole panel with your back turned to the audience. Like all good books, mine started with an Excel spreadsheet. I, at some point, made an Excel spreadsheet that had all of the songs that I could find that were sampled on the record, organized by, artist and song title and year. And when I sorted it by year, the patterns emerged.
Okay.
And, I sort of saw like the stories that some of these records were telling, based on the eras that had, oh wow, like a lot of these are from Watt Stacks. Well, what is the significance of Watt Stacks? What is the significance of Watt Stacks to Public Enemy? And it was just, a lot of it was just me going through and like learning more about these records so I could know more about a record I already loved.
Okay. Did you know this for your pitch, or you discovered that after?
Oh boy, it's like it all happened so fast.
Mm-hmm.
I think it might have been all started that, I maybe had the idea to do that, but like, once I started doing it, I really started seeing, the eras and the sounds that were coming out.
Okay. And what did it say did you in your eyes see about the album when you look at all these samples that
Well, it's like it was like sort of the history of black protest in music from like, 1967 to 1987.
Yeah.
Like it really, I don't want to say it's all there, but like a lot of it is there. And it's like you start, digging into like, what was happening at Stax? What was happening with James Brown's band? What was, and these kind of moments of tumult that these musicians were living, and into the most tumultuous rap record that ever existed.
Yeah,
so like that's it. The record sort of told the story.
Okay. And what about for you, Amanda? How did you decide on the format?
I mean, these books are so interesting, or the series is so interesting in that they're, it's significantly longer than a record review, but it's significantly shorter than, a sort of regular paperback book. It's this kind of odd sort of liminal space of 30,000 words. And it's like, well, what do I do with 30,000 words, And it can feel really paralyzing, I think, if you're used to working in either a longer or a shorter format. But it also feels like a kind of extraordinary opportunity to write, like, the sort of world's best batch of liner notes, if you can kind of do a good one. So for me, I was really interested, again, I felt like the nuts and bolts as far as the creation of the record itself, there wasn't a ton that I could sort of get into there. It takes up some real estate in the book, but at a certain point you just kind of run out of information. And I didn't want to do a sort of purely critical response to it or sort of purely critical analysis to it. So this sort of, the question of, well, what happened to this record after Nick Drake died, and kind of why didn't it work in 1972, but in 2000 it exploded. Those questions were really interesting, and those were questions where I felt like, if I talked to the right people and sort of thought long and hard about it and kind of read enough about what was going on, I could begin to, try to answer them.
Okay. And for you, Ryan, are you writing, I'm going to ask everyone this, are you writing for a particular audience? Are you writing for that super fan or for somebody you want to convert to listening to? Are you thinking about that in your audience?
Yeah, I think for mine, I worked with the assumption that, like, if somebody's buying a book about an album, if it's one like that, chances are they know and like it already, as opposed to maybe Born in the USA, like, it was a random one that, people might just pick up or whatever. But there was like a sort of other thread within it trying to argue, like, why James Murphy was an important songwriter for my generation. So I guess it did wind up kind of skewing more towards like the mid-20s to early 30s kind of range at the time, more so than people his own age, which is, I think, now 50 or so, close to 50. That wasn't really intentional, just kind of happened that way because of personal anecdotes woven into it and stuff like that. And as a result, I think people who are my age really related to it, and otherwise, maybe not.
Yeah.
But
what about everyone else?
I don't know about you guys, but when I write, I feel like I exist in a fiercely protected fantasy land where no one is ever reading anything I'm writing, because otherwise I am just seized by, fear and self-loathing. It's very hard for me to imagine an audience as I'm working.
that was after the fact that I wasn't thinking about. I was thinking about having to hit a word count in a very short period of time.
But I think, by and large, the audience for these books, they are music fans. I don't think anyone is going to sort of wander into a bookstore and casually pick up, a 33 1/3 on a record that they've never heard of, unless they, either are a huge fan of that artist or a fan of the series because they are kind of invested in, learning more about the records they love. So in that way, it's thrilling because it's an educated and it's a demanding and it's an intelligent audience. But, of course, it's also frightening for the same reasons.
Does 30... Okay.
Well, I suffer from a condition called crippling self-awareness.
Okay.
And I definitely wanted the book to be able to translate. And so I had 3 people read it. There was 3 people I definitely wanted to read it, and one was like an absolute super fan, you know, wax poetic style nerd, who in this case was the great Papa Whaley, the Miami bass historian. And then a more like casual fan who is, you know, my friend Corey Groh, who also works at Rolling Stone. And then someone who wasn't really familiar with the record at all, which was, you know, my then girlfriend, now wife. You know, I was always a fan of, you know, Spin magazine in the late 90s. And one thing that I always liked from their writing was even when they were writing about something I knew about, there was, you know, a liveliness and a color and an idea, like, you know, a way of approaching it that I hadn't thought of.
Okay.
You know, and so, you know, I wanted, you know, the story of It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back, like, it's been told. Like, it's definitely, like, not a record where there's a lack of information about it. It was one of the most famous rap records of the 80s. But, you know, I wanted to make sure that someone who was intimately familiar with the band, someone who was intimately familiar with rap music in the late 80s could pick this up and find it interesting, find the writing interesting, find the facts new and exciting, and then also be able to, you know, not bog it down in you know, inside baseball stuff to where someone who wasn't familiar with this record could enjoy it.
Okay. And what were the 3 feedback perspectives you got from these people?
I mean, it was basically a lot of small points of like, yeah, you know, this is nerd shit, take this out, or you know, like you're trying too hard to get this factoid in there, like that, you know, that type of stuff. And yeah, I mean, like it definitely helped to have like those 3 different audiences look at it, because I have no idea who's gonna actually see it. So.
Okay. George, did you have an audience in mind?
Well, it's first of all, I feel very much like Amanda, which is I can't think that anyone is going to end up reading the thing. It's any of the stuff that I write, but at the same time, you know, I did this and I'm doing what I'm doing because I really care about the subject. You know, it's really, to me this is like, you know, it's like it's essential to life. I mean, this matters. And so I was just trying to write it out and say, does this make sense to me? Does this make sense to me? And that was it. It's okay, this is what I want to say. And then, you know, I can't possibly anticipate any reader, but if anyone picks it up, that's fantastic.
Right. What do you want people to walk away from reading the books or to feel about the music? Did anyone think about that while you were writing?
Well, I want to say that that was part of it that I did, which is that, you know, this is experience this thing. I mean, you don't have to love this record. I think it's a hard record to love, but listen to it. You know, this is a rare kind of thing, and it's important and it's great that it exists in spite of all the, you know, the kind of unlikeliness in American culture that something like this would exist anywhere except outside of, you know, somebody's basement or, you know, La Mama or something like that. You know, the kitchen. You know, it exists, and people all over the world have been listening to it for decades. So, you know, this again, you know, it matters to me. So I hopefully I can make it matter to whoever reads the book.
Okay. What about everyone else?
I don't think I thought about that at all when I was writing it. In the years since, I guess what's been rewarding is when people say things about how it kind of articulated their experience with his music in ways they hadn't thought about before, you know, made them see a certain song a different way. Or I guess, you know, I kind of mentioned this earlier, but like what I was saying to do with some of it was like try to sketch out like what James like kind of tapped into in general and sort of like broader cultural atmospheric kind of things. And so when people say, you know, like that's, you know, why I liked his music but I never realized it, I guess that was sort of, you know, a win.
What about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like Ryan said, you want to make connections, between cultural objects or between cultural moments that maybe your reader hadn't thought of before. Ideally, you want to articulate something sort of real and true about the experience of hearing this thing that someone had maybe felt but had yet kind of put into words. But I feel like there's also an element of, it's like when you get on Facebook and everyone's posted a million pictures of their children because they love their kids so much and they want everyone else to see them. And it's a little bit like that for music nerds, where it's like, I love this thing. It's been so important to me. It sort of works on me in this way. It's foundational for me in this way. It changed my life in this way. Like, look at it. It's beautiful. Like, maybe it will do something for you, too. So there is some, I think, inherent in any cultural criticism, some element of, that's what makes it fun to write about these books, the idea that, you love something and now you get to share exactly what you love about it with a new audience.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Oh, the book, The Public Enemy is almost like a Trojan horse for me to talk about sampling as an art form. I have the era where it was a free-for-all was roughly, 1987 to 1993, like just this tiny window. What if, after they invented the guitar, electric guitar amplifier, the fuzz guitar, and they said, okay, you can use this for 5 years, and just this amazing postmodern moment, and all these tiny blips, these sounds that all have their own stories, that all have their own life, that all came from a time and a place. Like, I think about that, and I could have written a similar book about Paul's Boutique or about 3 Feet High and Rising, but obviously I love this record, and the explicit political nature of it opens up a lot to think about.
Yeah.
So
were you aware of sampling when you first listened to it, or was it just like?
I mean, it's
picture.
funny because like when I was a kid, I remember seeing the MTV news reports about Tone Loc, and then playing the loop of the Jamie's crying from doom 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 doom, playing it over and over again, and seeing the Turtles complaining about De La Soul. So I remember, MTV News definitely like helped hip a suburban kid to the idea of sampling as a concept, but it's not like I knew these records, and the example I love is like the California Love sample, the piano is Joe Cocker. I would have never known, I did not know that was a Joe Cocker record. I didn't know it was a Joe Cocker record when I, maybe if I heard it on the EPMD record, but there is a sense that you internalize just by hearing the way it sounds, like, oh, this is from somewhere else. This isn't someone in a studio. Like you can sense that in a lot of old records, and so the idea of the idea of sampling is exciting,
Okay.
even if you don't know the source material.
Okay. And I'm going to ask this without mentioning any titles. Were there books that you had read in the series where you're like, oh, God, I don't want to do that?
Wow, was there ever?
What were some of those things?
Oh, boy. There's some... I love this series. The Paul's Boutique one, amazing. The David Bowie Low book, I love... there's some just absolute monsters. There are some absolute stinkers. And, I will not name them, but I can certainly point to certain books where I was like, boy, I'm not doing that. And like one thing, and it's a different approach for everybody. And I'm not going to fault anyone for doing this, but like, I don't use the word I anywhere in the book. Like that was a conscious decision to never place myself in this narrative. And, I think, Matos is a great example of one that is personal that I really, really enjoyed. But there are other ones that are more personal that I'm just like, wow, dude, like you are not nearly as interesting as you think you are.
Everyone else?
I mean, we were talking earlier about sort of the demands or the expectations of your audience. I think some of the fictionalized books that are fictionalized responses to a record maybe make more demands on a reader. I mean, I think that's, you have to sort of say like, all right, I'm going to go along on this kind of weird journey with you, where you've written a novella or a series of short stories sort of based loosely on this record. I wouldn't have kind of the balls to do that, although I'm also not a fiction writer. So that's something I think would be more challenging. Also, some of the I teach music criticism at NYU, and I feel like when I talk to my students, when we write record reviews, I always encourage them to sort of resist the desire to do a track by track sort of, and then this song, and then it's like a paragraph of sort of just describing, and then this song, and to kind of think of the record maybe more sort of as a whole, as a text that sort of fits among other texts, rather than, I think it can get really boring for a reader to a really technical sort of bit, and then it was this pedal and this plug-in.
Yeah, I could go on the internet and hear the song.
Yeah. So that stuff for me it isn't quite as immediately engrossing.
Okay.
Yeah, I hadn't really read a lot of the ones that were. I've heard of the disasters.
Yeah.
But I don't.
Ones that got it right for you?
Well, I mean, the main one. I mean, I might have read this in your class. The Carl Wilson one.
Yeah.
That's kind of like one of the holy grails, but that's also like the example that nobody follows because it's not the traditional format. So that one was really good, and I'm drawing a blank otherwise.
I should say Ryan is a former student of mine.
Yes,
yes. This is incredibly cool. I have never been on a panel with a former student.
Oh, really?
I'm very proud of him and thrilled to be sitting at his side. Sorry,
Ryan, you had
I just mommed
goal
out.
to have your book out by what age was that when I interviewed you? Your first
I was
book?
25 when it
Okay,
came out.
you
And
met
fuck
them.
you, dude.
I mean, there are like drawbacks from having that happen. But
So we're sitting here talking about albums and books about albums in the streaming era. Do you feel that this will change how we read these books, or if these books should be done?
I mean, I mentioned liner notes before, which is a thing no one really has anymore. So I feel like the books can sort of function as a sort of substitute for that. And again, the best books are not merely a kind of Wikipedia reiteration. The best books are sort of really idea-driven. I think people are hungry for that. I think there's only so much you can say in a tweet. There's only, and I think the books sort of fill that. I hope so.
Yeah.
With music magazines closing and the sort of music press getting smaller and smaller.
Mm-hmm. How do you feel about streaming and the album?
Well, I wanted to point out, this is not a secret, but Spotify is going to start streaming 33 1/3 books
Okay.
sometime later this year.
Okay.
I don't know the details, but that is,
Nice.
I
didn't know that.
Nobody knows who's going to be reading them.
yeah, I was going to ask, do you know this? You work for 33 1/3 still,
I
right?
don't know who's going to be reading.
Yeah,
Turn on one
knows.
day and hear your book.
Nobody knows. Nobody knows anything. But I think, Amanda, I think that's an excellent point too, which is that, for people who really love these things, they want to. There's something you want to inhale other people's opinions about them, and that's what good liner notes are. You just don't get that thing that you can read, and it's that's satisfying.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, it's satisfying for me when I read the ones that I really enjoy. It's like, that enhances the experience.
Okay, great.
Well, the interesting thing about streaming too is like it really does, and the internet in general does create a slow boil snowball effect for a lot of these records. I think the Neutral Milk Hotel book is a great example of that, where it's like you could not have written that book when that came out, but slowly people get it and people understand what this thing is, and the democratic nature of streaming allowing for those stories to come out, means there's always going to be more stories.
Yeah, that's excellent. We're going to open it up for questions. Anyone have anything they want to add? Good. Nick, are you set? Okay. So you have questions. I see a first hand right here.
Thank you. Hi, I'm really curious about the pitch, the format, the length. What do they ask from you exactly? And one more thing I want to add, maybe now you can try it with the Fun Crusher Plus, now that Run the Jewels is so popular. I know I'd love to read that one.
Get at me, dogs. I don't remember. Mine was so long ago.
Well, I think they're not always. It's changed through the years. And it depends. It's changed depending on the editorial staff, which has changed through the years. So I think we all had slightly different experiences. I can say that mine was. This is when they were announcing. I think they still do the open proposal call, and it was very specific layout of, write an introduction. I think 1,000-word introduction, and do a chapter breakdown. Maybe 250 words describing the chapter. There's also, are there any other books on the subject? And, where do you see this fitting? All this, of course, subject to change, but the basic thing was I could see that they wanted some kind of coherent, organized idea.
Do any of you find that imposing?
Well, I didn't have to do a proposal for mine.
Okay, except for you, Ryan.
I was a series editor at 33 and Third from 2015 to 2017. So I was one of the 4 people who fielded the proposals, and we read many of them and had the very sort of difficult task of figuring out which proposals would make good books. And I certainly would not suggest that we did a perfect job of that or that that's an easy decision. I mean, I think the big thing, and this sounds incredibly simple, so simple it almost seems stupid, but we wanted books that had an idea. I mean, where the author really had an idea about the record and sort of what it meant and what it did, versus just, I love this record and it's really important, and I want to write 30,000 words about how much I love this record and how important it is. That there be something sort of extra musical to the narrative, that it have enough kind of context, enough enough of a story to sort of carry a reader along successfully for 30,000 words. Because again, we've been talking about this all night. It's sort of a big ask. I'm going to ask you to read this whole book about this one record. So we were really looking for kind of idea-driven proposals. And also, by the time I came to the series, we were sort of hungry for things a little bit outside of the canon. We would get a lot of proposals for, another book on a Rolling Stones record or another book on a Dylan record. I love Dylan and I love the Rolling Stones, but it was sort of like, well, let's do something a little bit weirder. I commissioned a book on the Wild Chupatulas, which is a band of Mardi Gras Indians, and their self-titled record is so good. It's one of the most sort of joyful and thrilling records I know. From an academic from California who was from New Orleans and could sort of write about that record in the context of Mardi Gras, in the context of the history of New Orleans music, in the context of the Mardi Gras Indians. I also commissioned a book on Tom Petty's Southern accents, which you'd think Tom Petty, okay, that's a no-brainer, but Southern accents is a really weird, sort of unpopular Tom Petty record. But the author had a really kind of great idea about, the South and the sort of iconography of the South. And during that tour, Petty was touring with a Confederate flag, which he later apologized for. But this whole sort of, and it's a book about Florida and Florida's relationship to the South. So there was all this other stuff going on. And I think for me, at least, and the group of editors that I was a part of, we were really looking for that.
Okay, great. Any other questions? Here in the back?
I'm wondering if you guys have any suggestions for pitching the editors for some of the publications you've written for. Just in a time when editors are getting hundreds of emails a day, I'm wondering if there's anything you could suggest to sort of stand out.
Yes, Christopher.
Okay, yeah, no, I'm gonna grab this. The one thing that no one seems to get is that, like, just pitching the name of a band and that they have something new out is that's worthless to me, because I see that I got the email too. It's great. So, like, the pitches, it's a lot like just what Amanda's saying. Have an idea, have something deeper than an artist. Not this artist is doing something interesting, but yeah, if you look at this artist, and this artist, they're all doing this right now, and it's weird. And I'd like to kind of ask them all about this, this wider thing. So it's like stuff that's, again, extra musical, like beyond, like, oh, this thing is good and interesting. Please send those things.
Michael?
Thank you. Christopher, you spoke at length about the ways in which sampling gives you a kind of background, a canon of other music, or like an autobiography of the artist. So like, this is what has influenced them, and this is what is interesting to them. So I'm curious for Ryan and Amanda and George, if through the process of listening again and again and again to these albums, you came up with similar and possibly even unknown or unrecognized background material, a kind of library behind it that somehow jumped out at you. I mean, presumably less obviously than in the case of sampling, but in a similar kind of foundational way.
Well, I can say, and this is the kind of a revelation to me, which is that one of the unique features of Bitches Brew is that it was made together by Miles Davis and his producer Tio Macero, and the first of the two LPs was entirely made by Miles having the band in the studio, playing short fragments of material. The band didn't really know what they were doing, and he was leading, just trying to listen for something that he liked. And then at the end of the day, Tio Macero took the tapes home and started splicing things together and he constructed those two albums, which I, this is something I knew about in general. As you get into it more deeply, that was fascinating to me with my background. But also, I did not realize this about Macero, who was a very interesting figure. But he had a degree from Juilliard. He was a decent composer and a decent saxophone player, but he paid his way through Juilliard by working in the recording studio as a recording engineer. And through Juilliard, he met Edgard Varese. And although nobody knows these details, there's some speculation, but he was at least around Varese when Varese was constructing his poème Électronique. So that was kind of poetic to me, because here is this piece of popular music that is musique concrète. And here is one of the first great musique concrète pieces, and Tio Macero is the link that brings them all together.
I'm sort of curious, a piggyback question off of your question, which is, inevitably as you write this book, the record stays the same, but you change, right? And the sort of the weird experience of listening to something for that long and that many times. I wonder if you guys, when you finished your books, did you have to take a break? I mean, how do you write a 33 1/3 and not hate the record afterwards?
Man, I saw them. They were doing the 20th anniversary tour. I saw them in London. I saw them at Pitchfork Fest. I saw them at Bonnaroo, where they played the album backwards. I saw them, if anything, it only made me love the album more and appreciate it more.
I had to take a break, but I also did wind up loving it more. I actually listened to yesterday for the first time in a long time, but then we got a new LCD Soundsystem record, so I was distracted. The question of the history thing, though, is really applicable to that. I think it actually is as obvious as sampling with LCD Soundsystem. I mean, the debut single was "Losing My Edge," where he literally listed all of his cool point, touchstones, which I think was a little bit more blurred on Sound of Silver, but you could still kind of tell, like, all right, this part came from Liquid Liquid, this part came from Talking Heads, this part came from ESG. But it was, that's kind of always obviously been a part of their story, but I think it's also one of the more interesting parts of their story and why that album is important, because it's really symbolic, I think, of how we now sort of consume and make art when we can have all these decades collapsed together into our, on our phone. And sort of, we've talked about this a lot before with, Amanda's written about all these like obscure, like early 20th century folk recordings that previously only existed on like 3 physical things in somebody's basement in various parts of the South. And now you can watch all those things on YouTube and then wind up watching a disco song afterwards, and wind up watching Justin
and then
Bieber.
get turned into a men's rights activist by accident.
On YouTube. Yeah. This is the double bind of the internet here. It's like, but you really derailed me there. I don't remember what I was talking about now. Because now I'm just thinking about how the internet sucks really badly. But.
For me with Pink Moon, which is such a hermetic record, right? There's not a lot. It's sort of such a channeling of Nick. When you write one of these books, you start referring to the artist by their first name. But it was interesting for me and sort of fascinating and exciting afterwards to find out all the people who'd been influenced by that album, and kind of the life that it had after Nick's life ended. How important it was to so many other records I loved. And that was a really exciting process of discovery for me, for sure.
Excellent. There's 2 hands over here.
For those of you with artists or who wrote about albums by artists who are still alive, did you hear back? I mean, I'm assuming, did you ever hear anything about? No?
It's not only did I've never interviewed him either, because I actually, the main part of my job is profiling artists, and James remains one of my only white whales. So I wrote a whole book about him, and I still have to do a cover story on him sometime. It hasn't happened yet.
I mean, me and Chuck have been on a panel together. I've interviewed him. No idea if he's read the book, but
Were any of you like nervous about for the people who are living, like what their response would be, or an estate, or getting back to you?
There's a part of me that felt like I might have been snitching a little bit on naming the samples.
Mm-hmm.
But with the exception of maybe like 1 or 2, like these are widely available. This information is widely available on the internet. There's an entire database dedicated to naming samples. There's Wikipedia is very good on big rap records on naming samples, and this record that's sold millions of copies is definitely the label's done some due diligence at this point, I would assume, but I think it was Hank Shockley of Public Enemy who said there is no statute of limitations on a sample. Mm-hmm. They can come at you 30 years down the line. So
you could have messed things up for them.
I could, right? Yeah. I mean, it definitely, went through my head. But hopefully they didn't have to pay anyone because I found some information readily available. It would be very silly for a band to discover this through my book and not the dozens of places they could read about this on the internet that cataloging this in great detail. So
yeah. And there's another question.
Yeah, my question is also piggybacking off what we were talking about earlier, what you guys were talking about earlier about the availability of music on streaming platforms and how easy it is to get anything. Really, do you think that has caused more of an appetite for deep dives into albums, or are people so bombarded by music that they just want the single and then they move on?
I mean, I think there's more deep dives than ever. I think that, with the kind of media bubble and content bubble that we're in right now, where there's like this constant desire for new, more now, there's an intense amount of deep dives into everything under the sun right now. And I wonder, A, if that well's going to run dry one day, and then I also wonder, B, is anyone actually reading all this stuff? But I mean, if you love something, there's a good chance you can find something that goes way too deep on it right now. We're definitely in like the media is definitely like director's commentary culture right now, and I'm certainly not immune from it myself. But it's a lot. Everyone's diving very, very deep. Scuba gear is on.
But I think the cultural metabolism is so revved up too now that big releases come out and it's all anyone talks about for 24 hours, and then it's like it never happened. It's like the next record comes out and it's gone. And I sort of, in a kind of sad, nostalgic way, sort of miss the circumstances of my youth in which I had to save up money and get my mom to drive me to the record store, and then I could buy one CD, and that was all I listened to till the next month when the process started over. And
if it sucked, you had to learn how to appreciate it.
If it sucked, I listened to it anyway because I didn't have anything else to listen to. I mean, this is why, like, if you put on some shitty Pavement EP from 1994, I know every single word. And it's just. I think there is, Chris was saying there is this sort of deep criticism going on now where we're perhaps overly dissecting, there's so much stuff to read, but at the same time, I feel like the deep listening is maybe not going on as much as it used to. And again, this is sort of nostalgic view, I realize, but just the sort of sheer volume of why keep listening to the same thing you listened to yesterday when you can get whatever, something brand new for free right now.
Yeah, and it's almost like there's a skin in the game where you have to go out and get the album that, you may at times make yourself like the album because you just keep listening to it over and over because you can't afford to get another album.
Sometimes they become your favorite albums later on. If someone released that album in the last 10 years, that if I just would have played this 4 more times, I would understand.
That would have been it.
Then, well, I have no idea because I move on now.
So, any other questions? Right here.
I feel like we're living in an era where we're asked in a lot of ways to inspect our inherent gender, racial, ethnic bias. And I was wondering, how does that inform your analysis and your writing when you're speaking for certain artists or figures?
Do I got to pick this up as the white guy that wrote about a rap album?
Yes.
Do I got to feel this one?
Yes.
Shit. No. Look. No, obviously, and and trust me, as someone who has loved hip hop and hip hop culture since I was 8 years old, this is something that I think about a lot, and I think that the only thing I can do is, try, I know that I'm an outsider. I know this. I don't need to be slipping in slang, like a lot of, young bloggers, trying. I don't have to ingratiate myself. It is, if you're aware of your privilege and are educated enough, then it shouldn't be a problem, And I think the two biggest problems come when someone doesn't recognize their place, and B, doesn't educate themselves. And we have a marketplace right now where we're just getting a constant churn of 22-year-olds to write about rap songs. They don't know where these words come from, these phrases, these ideas. There's an entire website called Rap Genius, updated by racist Australian teenagers. And this is how hip hop culture is being translated on the internet. And if you're gonna do this for real, you have to be aware of that stuff.
Did you feel any of that, George?
Well, no. Mainly because in my mind, there's also another incredibly pervasive bias in America that I would use that term, which is this, and people who don't think have it. I have it. Everybody has it, which is a sort of bias towards materialism and consumerism, and the end product essentially is that it is very hard in America to see something for the qualities that it has rather than the quantities of it. And I think this is especially pervasive with people talking about movies. You see this discussion of a movie, is it successful or not? It has to do with how many tickets it sold. It's not, is the movie successful? Does it work as a movie? It's, it didn't make enough money. And this is, I find this so maddening because the thing itself is what matters. And for myself, it's, jazz is important to me because it was, as a musician, it was my first love. It was really, can't explain it, but it's just, this is the thing that matters. And it is essential to American culture in so many ways, not just this, aesthetic culture, but racial culture as well. And it is so, it also maddens me that it is so generally ignored in American culture and in the marketplace. If somebody puts out a jazz album and it sells 3,000 copies, that's a success. Yeah. That means that 3,000 people in a country of 300 million people have heard this record. it has nothing to do with the quality, and that is a fucking shame. So I would say that there is this cultural history which really exists that's at the margins economically, but it matters to America, and so that is I'm trying to chip away at that myself.
Thank you. We're wrapping up. Yeah. So I want to thank everyone here on the panel. They will be here after. You can get the book. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for coming out tonight. As mentioned, I have a podcast, Talk Music Talk, available on all streaming outlets. So they're going to stick around, and thank you to the Strand, and have a good night.